It started with silence, just a whisper in the east. Then came the ships, drifting into European harbors like floating coffins. Within days, cities fell to chaos, priests vanished, families abandoned their own, and death danced through the streets. As half of Europe perished, fear turned neighbor against neighbor. But from the ashes rose rebellion, freedom, and a world forever changed. This is not just a story of plague, it's the moment history cracked open. Watch the untold story of the Black Death, and discover how its shadow still haunts us today. Let's start the story. Night settles over the steppes of Central Asia. The campfires of a caravan flicker dimly against the vast dark, while rodents scurry unseen beneath the wagons. One plague-carrying flea leaps from a dying marmot onto a passing rat, setting in motion a quiet catastrophe. The traders sleep, oblivious to the seeds of a storm now crawling into their blankets and supplies. This is how the Black Death begins, not with screams or sirens, but with silence. Centuries before Europe even heard of the Black Death, something sinister had been building far from the cities of Florence or Paris. Most historians agree that Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the plague, had its ancestral home in the rodent populations of Central Asia. Specifically, the disease may have first found a stable ecological niche in the marmots and ground squirrels that roamed the high plateaus of what is now modern-day Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and western China. In fact, one tantalizing clue emerged from a series of 14th-century tombstones in the Tian Shan region of Kyrgyzstan. The inscriptions mark sudden deaths around 1338, well before the plagues recognized European entry. Scholars still debate whether these tombs mark the earliest outbreak of the Black Death or a separate local flare-up. But the dating and geographic location offer an eerie prelude. It's important to understand that the world of the 14th century was more connected than we often imagine. Trade networks, silk roads, maritime routes, and even informal nomadic trails, stitched together continents. Goods flowed, as did ideas. And with them, microbes. The Mongol Empire, at its height, created what historians sometimes call the Pax Mongolica, a period of relative stability and safety across vast territories. But that same infrastructure, built to move goods quickly across great distances, also made it ideal for spreading disease. A rat could stow away in a grain cart and travel from Samarkand to Baghdad in weeks. A caravan driver could unknowingly carry a deadly flea across 3 ecological zones. Meanwhile, climate change played a subtle but critical role. A little ice age had begun to chill the northern hemisphere, disrupting food chains and forcing rodents out of their traditional habitats. That environmental pressure likely increased human-rodent contact. And war didn't help. The Mongol conquests had disrupted communities, displacing millions and creating perfect conditions for epidemics to emerge: crowded refugee camps, malnourishment, and psychological stress. One odd but fascinating fringe theory suggests that marmot hunting, a common practice in the region, may have triggered localized plague spillovers that predate the global outbreak. Marmots were prized not just for their meat but also for their thick fur. Hunters may have been the first human intermediaries between rodent and ruin. But for now, in the early 1340s, the world turned as usual. Markets bustled. Caravans rolled across deserts. And in their wake, a pathogen began to ride west, small, silent, unstoppable. What happened next would shake the foundations of medieval society. But it all started here, in the shadows of the East, where no one yet knew the name of the thing that would remake history. The caravan roads led westward, and so did the plague. By the early 1340s, merchant routes and military campaigns had unintentionally become veins through which the infection pulsed. It didn't gallop, at first, but crept. From village to town, from traveler to townsperson. Then it found ships. One of the earliest catastrophic entries into the historical record comes from the Crimean Peninsula. The port city of Kaffa, modern-day Feodosia, Ukraine, a Genoese trading post on the Black Sea, was under siege by Mongol forces in 1346. The attackers, possibly carrying the plague from their own eastern territories, began dying in great numbers. But what they did next would pass into legend. According to the 14th century chronicler Gabriel de Demusy, the Mongols catapulted plague-infected corpses over Kaffa's walls, effectively turning a military tactic into the first recorded instance of biological warfare. Scholars still debate whether this story was exaggerated or apocryphal. Was it the disease, not the dead, that breached the walls? Regardless, panic ensued inside the city. Genoese merchants and sailors fled by sea, desperate to escape the carnage. But they didn't leave empty-handed. On board those ships were grain sacks, and in them, rats. On the rats, fleas. Inside the fleas, Yersinia pestis. The Black Death had stowed away, waiting to leap again. By the time those ships reached Constantinople, Alexandria, and the ports of Italy, it was already too late. The infection no longer relied solely on land caravans. It had found faster, more densely populated corridors, the Mediterranean sea lanes. An overlooked irony is how globalized the medieval world actually was. Kaffa itself was a melting pot. Italians, Greeks, Armenians, Jews, and Tatars all lived and traded within its walls. When the plague hit, it didn't discriminate. But when the survivors fled, they carried not just goods but social panic and unknowable doom back to their home ports. One particularly strange and grim detail: the incubation period of bubonic plague is typically 2 to 6 days. That meant a sailor could appear perfectly healthy when boarding a ship, only to fall violently ill mid-voyage. Soon, the hold stank of vomit, blood, and corpses. These were not merchant vessels anymore, they were ghost ships, drifting with dead or dying crews. By 1347, stories were spreading faster than the disease itself. Of sailors collapsing at the docks. Of cities shutting their gates to arriving ships. Of bodies piling so fast in some ports that burial became impossible. Alexandria reportedly lost thousands per day. In Constantinople, the Byzantine court ordered mass graveyards dug into hillsides. In some cases, the land itself seemed to revolt. Earthquakes, bad harvests, and strange omens accompanied the spread. While mainstream historians agree on the route from Crimea through Mediterranean ports, some fringe theorists have proposed alternate vectors. One suggestion is that infected grain shipments may have reached parts of Europe independently of sailors, via overland routes through Anatolia. Another posits that wild rodents on the move due to environmental shifts may have spread the bacterium even before human contact. These remain unproven, but they underscore how difficult it is to track a truly invisible killer. What no one realized then, and many still struggle to accept, is how a microscopic organism had hijacked the very systems of trade, diplomacy, and warfare that defined the medieval world. By the time the ships arrived in Italy, the disease had already chosen its next victims. In October 1347, 12 Genoese ships limped into the harbor of Messina, Sicily. The townspeople rushed to meet them, expecting goods, news, perhaps even loved ones returning from the east. What they found instead was horror. The crewmen were either dead, dying, or visibly consumed by something unknown. They groaned with fever, their skin darkened with splotches, and their bodies oozed from grotesque swellings, buboes, we now call them. Within days, Messina was paralyzed with fear. The local authorities did what many would try in the coming months: they ordered the ships to leave. But it was too late. The Black Death had come ashore. Mainstream historians agree that Messina marked the first major entry point of the plague into Western Europe. From there, it fanned out across Sicily and into the Italian mainland. The disease seemed to move with eerie intelligence, following coastal trade routes and overland caravans into major cities, Genoa, Pisa, Venice, Marseille. Each new city it touched became a fresh center of infection. Contemporary accounts struggled to describe what they were witnessing. One of the most haunting comes from the Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio, whose Decameron opens with a graphic depiction of plague-ridden Florence. He described people dropping dead in the streets, of friends and family abandoning one another, and of houses left open, the inhabitants inside stiff with death. And yet, even in its early stages, the plague's behavior was baffling. Why did some towns lose half their populations while others were mysteriously spared? In some villages, entire families perished overnight. In others, entire regions saw barely a case. Scholars still debate whether this inconsistency was due to variations in rat populations, climate, or simply luck. What is clear is that Italy had no idea what it was facing. The disease had no name, no known cure, and no visible pattern. Physicians fell back on ancient Greek theories of miasma, bad air, and prescribed everything from crushed emeralds to bloodletting. Some even recommended avoiding baths, believing that open pores made the body vulnerable. But not everyone was mystified. A fringe yet fascinating detail, a handful of Islamic physicians, particularly in Cairo and Damascus, noted patterns of transmission that bordered on an understanding of contagion. They urged quarantines, isolation, and cleanliness, not out of scientific certainty, but out of observational wisdom. In many ways, their pragmatic approach surpassed that of their European counterparts. Back in Italy, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Venice, ever the efficient city-state, imposed early forms of quarantine, from the Italian 40 giorni, meaning 40 days. Ships were ordered to anchor offshore for over a month before passengers could disembark. It was one of the first institutional responses to plague, and a remarkable innovation given the fear and misinformation swirling at the time. But even such measures couldn't halt the tide. The disease was now moving faster than fear, carried by rats, fleas, trade, and travelers fleeing infected areas. Every attempt to seal a border simply redirected the pathogen elsewhere. And yet, this early phase, when the plague had just reached Europe, was still only the beginning. What followed would be a storm of unimaginable scale, reshaping the continent not just demographically, but spiritually and socially. For now, though, the people of Messina, Genoa, and Florence were learning something that would soon define an entire generation: there was no safety in the known world. By the spring of 1348, the Black Death was no longer creeping. It was racing. Across the European continent, towns and villages watched in growing dread as news arrived, of entire families perishing overnight in Provence, of bodies stacked like firewood in Florence, of prayers unanswered in Catalonia. Panic wasn't a wave anymore. It was the tide. And in the face of it, European society began to fracture. In many cities, civic order collapsed under the weight of mortality. Priests refused to give last rites, doctors abandoned their posts, and local governments disintegrated. Some urban centers turned to extreme measures. Milan famously walled up entire houses at the first sign of illness, sometimes sealing in the healthy with the sick. It's said this brutal tactic helped Milan fare far better than neighboring cities, though scholars still debate whether this success was statistical coincidence or an early form of effective quarantine. Elsewhere, desperation bred madness. In Germany and the Low Countries, flagellant movements arose, hordes of men and women who marched from town to town whipping themselves publicly, trying to appease divine wrath. They sang hymns, carried banners, and beat their backs bloody in open squares. To them, the plague was punishment for human sin, and only through suffering could they hope to earn mercy. The church, meanwhile, floundered. While some clergy bravely stayed to comfort the dying, others fled, often in luxurious convoys, drawing the scorn of their flocks. In Avignon, where Pope Clement VI had taken refuge, so many corpses piled up that the papal palace began buying fields for mass graves. The pontiff reportedly blessed the entire Rhone River so bodies could be dumped in with minimal sin. Medical science, such as it was, offered little help. The standard practice involved balancing the four bodily humors through bleeding, purging, and herbal remedies. Physicians wore robes and long, bird-like masks stuffed with lavender and camphor, a macabre look that became iconic of the era. Yet this costume was more ritual than protection. The real killer moved invisibly, from flea to rat to man, oblivious to leeches or lavender. A curious fringe remedy involved strapping live chickens to buboes, under the belief that the chicken would draw out the poison. Unsurprisingly, it worked only for the chicken, who, in many cases, perished too. Social rules broke down. Neighbors stopped speaking. Marketplaces emptied. Families locked their doors not just to outsiders, but to their own kin. In one infamous Paris account, a mother abandoned her plague-stricken child to die alone, only to later die the same way, untouched and unburied. And yet, the disease didn't strike evenly. Some villages, seemingly doomed, were mysteriously spared. Others were decimated despite isolation. Scholars still debate whether these inconsistencies came down to genetic resistance, geographic luck, or differences in local rat populations. Even today, why some regions suffered more than others remains a riddle. As the plague moved inland, into Germany, England, and beyond, people began to look not just outward for explanations, but inward. If God wasn't saving them, perhaps he was punishing them. If neighbors were falling ill, perhaps they were already cursed. The fear of infection warped into something deeper, a fear of the other. And that fear would soon erupt into something even darker than disease. But here, in the thick of it, all Europe could do was watch the bodies pile up, the institutions crumble, and the sky turn silent. By 1349, the Black Death had reached the heart of Europe. It moved with chilling efficiency, through port cities, up rivers, and along trade roads, as if following a sinister map no one else could see. Paris, Cologne, Vienna, and eventually London fell one by one, and with them, their surrounding villages. It is estimated that between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population perished in just 4 years. That's somewhere between 25 and 50 million people. But the toll wasn't uniform, and that's where the mystery deepens. Some towns were wiped clean from the map, their names now remembered only in church registers or weathered stones. Others, sometimes just miles away, reported only a handful of deaths. Why? Scholars still debate whether local climate, rat populations, or variations in human immunity played a role. One theory suggests that certain regions, especially high-altitude or colder areas, were less hospitable to the fleas that carried the plague. Another proposes that isolated communities, monasteries, for example, fared better purely due to lack of contact. Still, randomness reigned. In England, the plague is believed to have arrived through Weymouth, then spread inland like wildfire. In London, mass graves, like the infamous East Smithfield Cemetery, were dug around the clock. Contemporary accounts describe carts piled high with corpses, ringing through the streets with the eerie cry, "Bring out your dead." And yet, some rural parishes saw only minimal losses, leaving historians to wonder whether isolation, luck, or something less understood was at play. What is certain is that the way people lived, and died, changed radically. In Prague, King Charles IV closed the city gates and managed to shield the city for months. But even that wasn't foolproof. Disease eventually crept in. In Norway, the plague is said to have arrived aboard a ghost ship that drifted ashore, its crew long dead. A popular, though possibly apocryphal, tale, but one that captured the era's morbid imagination. As the bodies multiplied, burial practices faltered. Churches couldn't keep up with the dead. Mass graves, some containing thousands, became the grim new norm. In some places, grave diggers died faster than they could dig. In others, the dead were left where they fell, turning entire neighborhoods into open-air mausoleums. One of the strangest effects of the death toll was silence. The constant clamor of medieval towns, the ringing of bells, the barking of dogs, the chatter of markets, gave way to something unnatural. Many chroniclers wrote of birdsong in cities where none had been heard in years. Even animals wandered confused through empty streets. Horses grazed freely in town squares. In Paris, a monk wrote that the only sounds were the wind and the crying of the sick. Amid the devastation, stories emerged of miraculous survivals. People who slept in the same bed as plague victims and somehow lived. Towns that held mass processions and saw the disease vanish. Entire neighborhoods spared for no apparent reason. A fringe idea, later disproven, held that certain bloodlines were immune. Still, these anecdotes fueled early ideas about resistance and immunity, concepts far ahead of their time. And the disease didn't end with bubonic symptoms. Some victims developed the pneumonic form, a variant that spread directly from person to person via coughing. It was faster, deadlier, and terrifyingly efficient in crowded urban centers. This form bypassed fleas entirely, turning human breath into a weapon. By 1350, the great cities of Europe had become hollowed shells. Cathedrals stood empty. Thrones went unclaimed. Fields lay fallow. In many places, there were simply no people left to bury the dead or harvest the crops. Yet amid the devastation, something new began to stir, a shift in power, in faith, in the very structure of society. But first came the blame. When disaster strikes without warning or reason, humans reach for explanations. In the age of the Black Death, many found their scapegoats close at hand. As the plague raged, whispers became accusations. That the disease wasn't natural. That someone, somewhere, had poisoned the wells, cursed the air, or summoned the wrath of God. And in city after city, that suspicion settled on a familiar target, Europe's Jewish communities. Jews had long lived in segregated quarters, often barred from land ownership, trade guilds, or public office. Their visibility, and isolation, made them easy to demonize. When a plague-swept town found its Christian residents dying while some Jewish families appeared to suffer fewer losses, often due to separate water sources and strict ritual cleanliness, the rumors flared into flames. In Strasbourg, on Valentine's Day 1349, 2,000 Jews were rounded up and burned alive in the town square. In Basel, the entire Jewish population was expelled. In dozens of other cities, pogroms left neighborhoods in ash and silence. Some cities even passed laws forbidding Jews from returning, at least until the plague ended, and debts needed collecting. Yet even at the time, not everyone bought the poison well theory. Pope Clement VI issued a formal decree declaring the accusations baseless, stating that Jews were dying of the plague too. His edict slowed the violence in some regions but couldn't stop it entirely. Fear, once unleashed, rarely follows logic. And Jews weren't the only ones blamed. Lepers, foreigners, beggars, and even monks fell under suspicion. The sick were often abandoned, walled in, or left to die in open fields. In some towns, plague wardens were tasked with dragging the infected from their homes and sealing the doors behind them. The distinction between mercy and cruelty blurred. Among the strangest turns of all was the explosion of pseudoscientific charlatanry. Self-proclaimed healers wandered town to town, selling talismans, incense, and cures made of powdered unicorn horn or crushed emerald. One popular item was the so-called plague stone, a rock anointed with vinegar, which people were told to touch instead of each other. Whether these remedies helped is doubtful, but they reveal something poignant, a desperate yearning for control. One fringe case from Poland remains a puzzle to this day. The kingdom, under King Casimir III, appeared to suffer far fewer deaths than neighboring regions. Some attribute this to the king's tolerance toward Jews and stricter trade controls. Others suggest Poland's rural, spread-out population made rapid transmission harder. Scholars still debate whether this anomaly was real or exaggerated, but it continues to intrigue epidemiologists centuries later. Fear also made people turn inward. Religious zealotry surged. Some turned to saints' relics, pilgrimages, or processions. Others joined cult-like movements predicting the end of the world. A particularly grim sect in Germany encouraged followers to dig their own graves in anticipation of Judgment Day. For many, life itself no longer made sense. And yet, even in the madness, there were flickers of compassion. Some nuns chose to stay behind and care for the dying, even knowing they would likely perish. A few city councils managed to coordinate rudimentary health efforts, cleansing streets, burning contaminated belongings, organizing food for quarantined homes. But these were the exceptions. In the wider picture, the Black Death didn't just kill bodies. It corroded the bonds of trust, between neighbors, between communities, between faith and reason. It made monsters of men and martyrs of others. And when it finally loosened its grip, the survivors looked around and saw a world unrecognizable. Still, something strange had happened in the shadows. In the cracks of this broken world, new ideas and new freedoms were beginning to take root. The worst had passed by 1351. The plague's rampage slowed, not because it had been defeated, but because it had, quite simply, run out of fuel. So many were dead, so many towns abandoned, that in some areas, there were no hosts left to infect. And in the aftermath, Europe did not return to what it had been. It couldn't. Fields lay overgrown. Roads were silent. The toll on labor was catastrophic, entire guilds vanished, workshops stood empty, and farmlands lay fallow with no one to till them. But where there is scarcity, there is power. For the first time in centuries, peasants and workers held the upper hand. Serfs walked away from their lords' estates, demanding wages, better conditions, and freedom of movement. In some regions, entire villages simply relocated, abandoning oppressive feudal contracts and starting new lives. Suddenly, a plowman's labor was no longer cheap, it was precious. Landowners and monarchs panicked. Laws were hastily written to freeze wages, ban laborers from moving, and enforce obedience. In England, this took form in the Ordinance of Labourers, 1349, an attempt to fix wages at pre-plague levels. But such laws were hard to enforce. With a third or more of the population gone, there simply weren't enough people left to keep the old order intact. This shift sparked early tremors of what would one day become a class revolution. A century later, events like the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England would draw a direct line from plague to protest. Scholars still debate whether the Black Death caused the end of feudalism, or merely accelerated it. But few deny its role as a turning point. Religion, too, felt the aftershocks. Trust in the Church, already eroded by its often self-serving response during the plague, continued to wane. Why had prayers failed? Why had holy relics not saved the faithful? And why had so many priests fled while commoners stayed behind? In response, new forms of spirituality emerged, some mystical, some personal, many outside the Church's control. Lay religious movements flourished, and in time, seeds were sown for reformation and rebellion. In some parts of Europe, cathedral attendance plummeted, while in others, shrines overflowed with desperate pilgrims. Belief didn't vanish, it fragmented. Medicine, too, faced a reckoning. The old humoral theories had failed spectacularly. The best doctors in Paris or Avignon had died alongside farmers and fishermen. People began to question the authority of ancient texts. Slowly, observation started to edge out tradition. And in art, a strange duality appeared. The trauma of the Black Death gave rise to memento mori, art that fixated on death, decay, and the fragility of life. Skeletons danced in murals. Time-devouring worms adorned tombs. And yet, this was not merely macabre, it was cathartic. It acknowledged loss in ways words could not. One curious effect, the plague seemed to spare certain institutions with surprising consistency. Monasteries, for instance, often suffered devastating losses, yet they rebounded quickly. Universities, too, began to shift, focusing more on logic and natural philosophy than strictly theological study. The world was not abandoning faith, but it was beginning to think differently. In the countryside, survivors inherited abandoned homes, tools, and animals. A peasant who had once owned nothing might now possess fields and a plow. Widows suddenly controlled property. Orphans, if they lived, sometimes rose in social rank overnight. Society's rigid caste lines blurred, not entirely, not evenly, but enough to change the trajectory of generations. Even language changed. In England, for instance, the dominance of French among the ruling classes began to erode as English reasserted itself. Fewer clerks meant fewer scribes fluent in Latin or Norman French. The common tongue began to rise. So much had died, but not everything. And in the eerie quiet after the storm, Europe wasn't just mourning. It was reshaping itself. Though the worst wave had passed by 1351, the Black Death never truly left. It didn't vanish like a nightmare at dawn, it lingered, retreated, and returned. Over the next 3 centuries, recurring outbreaks haunted Europe. They struck in pulses, less catastrophic than the first but deadly nonetheless. London in 1361, Paris in 1363, Venice in 1371, and again in 1400, and 1430, and on and on. Each time, communities braced, hoping the horror wouldn't reach them again. Often, it did. These were not just echoes, they were reminders that life in the post-plague world would always carry the shadow of its memory. Scholars still debate whether these later outbreaks were caused by the same Yersinia pestis strain or mutations of it. Some suspect the bacterium evolved, growing less virulent but more persistent. Others believe environmental shifts and rat populations played a larger role. The truth remains elusive. But the cultural memory endured. The Black Death rewired how Europe thought about disease, mortality, and the fragility of human control. Quarantine became an institution. Cities like Venice and Dubrovnik established official lazarettos, quarantine islands where travelers were held for 40 days before entering the city. The practice spread, becoming a cornerstone of public health policy for centuries. More than just physical measures, the plague left fingerprints on language and metaphor. Words like plague, pestilence, and quarantine embedded themselves into everyday vocabulary, not just to describe disease, but to symbolize fear, chaos, and the breakdown of order. Even today, we still call terrible things plagues, of war, addiction, corruption, as if the 14th century's terror still echoes in our tongues. In literature, the plague's legacy was equally lasting. Boccaccio's Decameron, written in the plague's shadow, birthed a new form of storytelling, raw, human, intimate. Later, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales would carry a similar spirit. Even Shakespeare, writing during later outbreaks, often alluded to plague in metaphors of madness, love, and fate. One strange but powerful symbol that emerged was the danse macabre, the dance of death. In paintings and carvings across Europe, skeletons danced with kings, monks, merchants, and peasants. No one escaped. It was a visual theology, reminding all that death was the great equalizer. These weren't just art, they were survival manuals for the soul. Modern researchers still wrestle with one of the biggest puzzles: why did the Black Death eventually recede? Did immunity build up in the population? Did rodents change behavior? Or was it simply the result of social changes, better sanitation, smarter trade policies, or new urban design? The question remains open. There are even competing theories about the very identity of the Black Death. While Yersinia pestis remains the dominant explanation, some fringe historians suggest the plague may have also included viral components, or perhaps a hemorrhagic fever lost to time. Genetic studies of plague pits continue to uncover new clues, but conclusive answers remain just out of reach. Yet even with all we still don't know, the Black Death undeniably shaped the world we live in. It changed medicine, not immediately, but profoundly. It pushed public health forward, if only because doing nothing had failed so completely. It changed labor and economics, appending the medieval hierarchy. And it reshaped faith, not by destroying it, but by diversifying it, forcing people to seek meaning beyond the church walls. Above all, it reminded humans, then and now, of our fragility. And perhaps that's the most enduring legacy, not just in graves or ruins, but in our collective memory, in the stories we pass down, and in the systems we build to protect ourselves from the next invisible enemy. Conclusion. The Black Death was more than a tragedy, it was a reckoning. In just a few short years, it dismantled systems that had stood for centuries, shook the foundations of belief, and rewrote the rules of power. Yet from its shadow rose a world transformed, one more skeptical of authority, more questioning of tradition, and more attuned to the fragility of life. The plague didn't end history, it accelerated it. And while science and medicine have advanced, the Black Death's haunting lessons still echo in our responses to modern pandemics. We carry its memory, not as fear, but as wisdom earned in blood and silence.